This hearing will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Budget Committee's hearing on Machines, Artificial Intelligence, and the Workforce, Recovering and Readying Our Economy for the Future. Before we begin, I want to welcome the newest member of the Budget Committee, Chris Jacobs. Welcome, Chris. Before coming to Congress, Chris was a New York State Senator, and the committee is happy to have you here. Now, before I welcome our witnesses, I will go over a few housekeeping matters. At the outset, I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare a recess at any time to address technical difficulties that may arise with such remote proceedings. Without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, we are holding this hearing virtually in compliance with the regulations for committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolutions 965. First, consistent with regulations, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when they are recognized for their 5 minutes. We are not permitted to unmute members unless they explicitly request assistance. If I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. They will not unmute you under any other circumstances. Second, members must have their cameras on throughout this proceeding and must be visible on screen in order to be recognized. As a reminder, members may not participate in more than one committee proceeding simultaneously. For those members not wanting to wear a mask, the House rules provide a way to participate remotely from your office without being physically present in the hearing room. Now, I will introduce our witnesses. This afternoon, we will be hearing from Dr. Susan Athey, Economics of Technology Professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business and Associate Director at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Dr. Darren Asamoglu, Institute Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Darrell West, Vice President and Director of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, and Dr. Jason Matheny, Director for the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University and Commissioner for the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, who I might add has just informed me he is from Louisville, Kentucky. So we're especially glad to have him here with us. Thank you all for being with us today. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for an opening statement. This year, Labor Day felt different than previous years. While most of us still honored our workers and celebrated their vital contributions to our nation, especially our frontline workers, we also recognized the hardships faced by millions of laid-off Americans and their families, struggling to get by amid global pandemic and the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Yet these twin crises have amplified problems that existed long before the coronavirus. Devastating healthcare inequities, the loss of stable, well-paying jobs, and stagnating wages. While our economy has slowed, exacerbating these underlying issues, technological change has marched on, creating even more challenges. As we look to the future, artificial intelligence, or AI, has significant potential to disrupt the world. It presents opportunities to improve lives, livelihoods, productivity, and equality. However, it also poses serious risks of large-scale economic changes. Today's hearing will help us ground our thinking in facts and better prepare for this impending economic transition. Like the arrival of the steam engine, electricity, and computers, AI will reshape a broad swath of industries and jobs. However, history shows us that while technological advancements can create new jobs and increase productivity and growth, these benefits have been paired with the elimination of old jobs and increased inequality as some workers are left behind. Today, we are losing jobs because the administration's failed response to the pandemic and economic crisis. But as the economy eventually recovers, workers may find it difficult to get their job back as companies replace jobs with new AI-enabled automation. So while advancements in AI technologies could create more opportunities for workers with advanced education or specialized skills, workers without these skills could see fewer opportunities in the near future, and it's low and middle wage jobs that are most at risk. Since the mid-1980s, but prior to the pandemic, 88% of of middle skill job losses associated with the automation of routine tasks took place within 12 months of a recession. Absent concerted efforts to foster an inclusive recovery, AI and automation could exacerbate income inequality, widen racial and gender income gaps, and push more people into poverty when we eventually emerge from this recession. There is already a large and persistent racial wealth gap in America, and since Black and Latino Americans are overrepresented in occupations at high risk for automation, they are disproportionately at risk of job and wage losses. Additionally, there are 40% more women than men who work in occupations at high risk for automation. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that AI and automation could eliminate upwards of 14% of today's jobs and disrupt an additional 32%. Current AI technologies have also raised concerns around replicating human biases and discrimination in algorithms. Given the range of AI applications emerging in employment, housing, healthcare, financial services, and criminal justice, improved transparency and oversight are needed to ensure AI tools do not replicate or expand discriminatory practices. Just like previous technological breakthroughs, AI will broadly impact the federal budget. Along with IT modernization, AI can directly improve the efficiency and effectiveness of government operations, leading to savings. With the industry set to generate additional economic activity of up to $13 trillion worldwide by 2030, federal R&D investments will remain essential to U.S. leadership and competitiveness in AI technology. However, the benefits will only be available to all Americans if paired with strategic investments to support our workforce through this impending evolution. The pandemic and economic crisis have already shown that income security and related programs are crucial for supporting Americans during challenging times. The shifting job landscape expected with widespread AI implementation further demonstrate this need. This will require strong federal investments in social programs and affordable health care, child care, and housing, as well as new approaches for retraining and upskilling our workforce. IBM estimates that between 2019 and 2022, more than 120 million workers in the world's 12 largest economies may need to be retrained and reskilled as a result of AI-enabled automation. If we fail to plan ahead, the underlying problems illuminated by the pandemic and recession will continue to create barriers to success for American workers. We have a responsibility to get Americans through the COVID crisis, but we also must address the long-term economic challenges we know are coming. These issues are complicated and nuanced, but that's why we are here today. With the help of our expert witnesses, we can begin to chart a path forward that leads to inclusive economic growth, broad social benefits, and a better prepared workforce. I look forward to learning more about the magnitude of the potential changes to our economy and job market and the federal policies that will be needed in response. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Womack of Arkansas.
And I thank the chairman for holding this hearing, and my thanks to the witnesses who will be with us today. I'd like to also add my a bit of welcome to Chris Jacobs, the newest member of the committee, native of Buffalo, New York. Long history of public service, Erie County Clerk, State Senator, now joining us as a member of Congress. This isn't his first tour of duty at the Capitol. He began his career working for former Congressman and Buffalo Bill quarterback Jack Kemp. Chris, welcome to the Budget Committee. To your wife and daughter, Martina and Anna, thank you for allowing your husband and father to continue his public service career by spending time in Washington with all of us. Chris, we welcome you to the committee. We're here to talk about AI capabilities, both current and future, and the impacts on the economy and the federal budget. It's a critical technology, to be sure, that will benefit the lives of many Americans and touch nearly every sector of the U.S. economy. While it will likely change the way many jobs are performed, as technological advances have for many decades, we must harness the capabilities of AI to help drive our economy and society forward. Congress has to ensure that its actions do not stifle innovation. Rather, government should work in partnership with the private sector to move our country forward in AI research and development. By making strategic federal investments in AI, R&D, Washington can help unleash America's pioneering and entrepreneurial spirit. It also means creating a regulatory environment that supports, not hinders, private industry by allowing technological advancements to flourish in a safe, trustworthy, and effective way. Congress should also move to encourage more American high-tech manufacturing in general. The U.S. currently relies on countries located in geopolitical hotspots for many critical components, and as the coronavirus pandemic has shown with medical supplies, we need to ensure we have reliable, secure, and diverse supply chains for vital materials. Now, while this is an interesting and important topic, it should not be the reason why the Budget Committee is convening this afternoon, in my strong opinion. The dire fiscal outlook, notably the recent deficit and debt projections, and a discussion on how to tackle these challenges should be the focus of today's committee meeting. Last week, the Congressional Budget Office released its Budget Outlook Update, and let me tell you, the findings are incredibly sobering, but not surprising. We did not do our job when this pandemic, before the pandemic hit. This committee is charged with writing a budget to put our country on a responsible fiscal path, but we failed in that duty. Once COVID hit, we were obligated to respond to the crisis. For those of you who don't know, let me summarize where our nation stands fiscally, and let me just warn you, it isn't good. The deficit for fiscal 20 is projected to be $3.3 trillion, more than triple the previous year's deficit, and by far the highest in American history. Every single year for the next 10 years, CBO is projecting that annual deficits will exceed $1 trillion and total $13 trillion over this period. The public debt is projected to be larger than the size of the entire economy by next year, that is 104% of GDP, and will continue to increase to more than $33 trillion by fiscal 2030. That's 109% of projected GDP. Once again, CBO confirmed the driver of the fiscal problem: federal spending, particularly mandatory spending. Mandatory spending, including interest payments on the debt, is expected to account for 75% of total federal spending by 2030. And I don't need to be the guy to tell you, you already know that's squeezing resources for many discretionary priorities. The job of this committee is to write a budget resolution that sets a fiscal path for the government to follow. We didn't write one. We don't have one. Instead of considering a budget resolution, we're talking about artificial intelligence, which, as I mentioned before, while an interesting topic and an important topic, it's not the mandate of this committee. The Democrat majority has neglected to do a budget resolution for the past 2 years. CBO's projections illustrate the necessity for the Democrat majority to do its job, write and pass a budget resolution that provides a responsible fiscal framework to correct this current fiscal trajectory. With that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and always look forward to the discussion. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back the balance of my time. Chairman, you'll need to unmute, I think.
Thank you. Should be up to that by now. In the interest of time, once again, if any member has an additional member has an opening statement, you may submit those statements electronically to the clerk for the record. Once again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here this afternoon. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made a part of the formal hearing record. Each of you will have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. As a reminder, please unmute your microphone before speaking. I now introduce and yield 5 minutes to Dr. Susan Athey. Please unmute your mic and begin when you are ready.
Hello, Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Artificial intelligence seems to inspire extreme views. Some focus on a future where robots take all the jobs, while others point out that so far its effects on the economy are barely detectable. My own view is that AI has enormous positive potential for society and for the efficiency and finances of governments, and that governments and universities have a crucial role to play in ensuring that the potential is realized. AI, of course, also creates challenges, contributing to an era where workers transition more frequently and require more reskilling throughout their careers. So we need to ensure that our institutions are prepared to meet this reality, especially in light of the many fiscal and labor market challenges created by an aging population and workforce. But when R&D is directed at technology that augments human workers and supports citizens in their lives and health, we may be able to expand the circumstances in which people engage in rewarding work while experiencing a high quality of life in areas with a more moderate cost of living. Some of the most promising areas where technology can be part of the solution include education, training, remote work, medicine, and government services. In each case, digital technology and powered by AI can be used to make services cheaper to provide, higher quality, more tailored to the individual need, and substantially more accessible and convenient. The accessibility matters particularly to people with limited time, like working people with caregiving responsibilities, and especially rural residents who face a dual burden of high transportation costs and insufficient density to support specialized services and job opportunities in their local communities. One reason the potential is so great for these problems is that digitization and the adoption of AI can lead to low marginal cost, scalable, and thus more efficient services. Digitization and AI are inextricably linked to measurement and optimization, which naturally improves the accountability and effectiveness of the organizations who adopt them, including the government. In addition, general trends that have led to the rapid diffusion of AI relate to the lowered fixed costs and time required to adopt it. One trend is just the digitization of everything from consumer interactions to supply chains. That creation of data is what powers and makes possible AI to be an optimization. The way IT is implemented has also changed. Cloud computing allows companies to rent computing as they need it rather than buy, allowing infrastructure to be shared across firms, and that reduces cost. Software as a service lets companies subscribe to services and purchase the best products use case by use case. And that software as a service then can also make available AI and machine learning innovations without firms having to do that R&D themselves. Finally, we've seen a big expansion of open source software. And in general, data management and analytics tools are widely available. They're shared across firms and across academia and thus diffuse very quickly. The latest machine learning algorithms are typically free. For example, for my class, we used algorithms that we downloaded that were trained using Facebook's image data set and computing infrastructure, allowing the students to move on to the analytics on top of the image recognition. The reason that firms are willing to share those types of algorithms is that it's customer relationships and data, as well as know how to optimize the algorithms at large scale that give companies their competitive advantage. And the general purpose technologies and algorithms have actually been fairly widely available. That means the cost of developing services is reduced as these general purpose innovations from academia and for-profit organizations can be repurposed by entrepreneurs, governments, and social impact organizations. Now, an important precursor to a policy discussion is demystifying the technology. In practice, rather than sort of general intelligence, most of what we've seen in the past 15 years can be thought of as more automation on steroids. For software, automation is like following pre-specified rules without real-time human direction. But the latest innovations have concerned implementing automation using decision rules that are learned from past data using machine learning. In a common example of machine learning, an algorithm might take as input a digital photo and output a guess of what animal's in the photo. Traditionally, analysts had to do a lot of manual work to customize these statistical models, so the models were simplified. But modern machine learning allows the analyst to just feed in raw data, and the algorithm does a lot of work to determine what's important for the task. This makes things general purpose, but the fact that they're general purpose also means they're black box, and sometimes even the engineers building them don't understand them. Thus, we need a lot more research and best practices to make sure that this technology is implemented safely and without unintended consequences. Just to close, machine learning is diffusing across the economy use case by use case, but in most cases, this has led to an incremental innovation and incremental changes over time rather than sudden shifts. So I look forward to continuing the discussion in the question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. Asamoglu for 5 minutes. Please unmute and the floor is yours.
Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify on this important subject. The U.S. economy today and U.S. workers are suffering from what I view as excessive automation. The extent of automation is excessive, in that it is not leading to sufficient productivity growth, creating new tasks for humans, or increasing wages. Automation, the substitution of machines and algorithms for tasks previously performed by labor, is nothing new. It has often been an engine of economic growth, but in the past, for example, during the era of the mechanization of agriculture, it was part of a broad technology portfolio, and its potentially negative effects on labor were counterbalanced by other technologies. Not today. Recent advances in AI and machine learning are not responsible for these trends. In fact, AI, as a broad technological platform with great promise, can be used for helping human productivity and creating new human tasks. But it could exacerbate the same trends if we use it just for automation. The COVID-19 pandemic will also contribute to this predicament, as there are now more reasons for employers to look for ways of substituting machines for workers, and recent evidence suggests that they are already doing so. Excessive automation has already been a major drag for the US economy. Private sector spending on workers, which increased steadily and rapidly almost every year in the 4 decades following World War II, has been essentially stagnant over the last 20 years. The decline in the share of labor in national income, the stagnation of middle-class wages, and the huge increase in inequality are all connected to our recent unbalanced technology portfolio, prioritizing automation and not much else. Excessive automation is not an inexorable development. It is a result of choices, and we can make different choices. While there is no consensus on exactly what brought us to this state, we know of a number of factors that have encouraged greater automation. Chief among these has been the transformation in the technology strategies of leading companies. American and world technology is shaped by the decisions of a handful of very large and very successful tech companies with tiny workforces and business models centered on the substitution of algorithms for humans. There's, of course, nothing wrong with successful companies pushing their vision, but when this becomes the only game in town, we have to watch out for. Past technological successes have often been fueled by a diversity of perspectives and approaches. The dominance of the paradigm of a handful of companies has been exacerbated by the dwindling support of the US government for fundamental research. The transformative technologies of the 20th century, such as antibiotics, sensors, modern engines, and the internet, have the fingerprints of the government all over them. The governments funded and purchased these technologies and often set the agenda, but no longer. Last but not least, government policy encouraging automation excessively through its tax code. The US tax system has always treated capital more favorably than labor. My own research estimates that over the last 40 years, via payroll and federal income taxes, labor has paid an effective tax rate of over 25%. Even 20 years ago, capital was taxed more lightly, with equipment and software facing tax rates around 15%. This differential has significantly widened with tax cuts on high incomes, the shift of many businesses to S corporation status that are exempt from corporate income taxes, and very generous depreciation allowances. Software and equipment are now taxed at about 5%, and in some cases, corporations can get a net subsidy when they invest in capital. This generates a powerful motive for excessive automation. One result of all of this has been the disappearance of good jobs, especially for workers without postgraduate degrees or very specialized skills. The only way to alter this technology is to redirect technological change. That will require changes in federal policy. A first step would be to correct the asymmetric taxation of the asymmetric taxation of capital and labor. This would go a long way, but is not sufficient by itself. A second step is to reevaluate the role of big tech companies in our lives, including in the direction of technology. This, of course, goes beyond debates about automation and AI, as it relates to the issue of limiting the size and the dominance of big tech. These measures can be strengthened with government R&D policies specifically targeting technologies that help human productivity and increase labor demand. Research policies that target specific classes of technologies are rightly controversial. They may be particularly challenging in the context of choosing between automation and human-friendly technologies, since identifying these is non-trivial. Nevertheless, I would like to end my comments by emphasizing that such policies have been adopted and have had successes in the past. 4 decades ago, renewable energy was prohibitively expensive, and the basic know-how for green technology was lacking. Today, renewables already make up 19% of energy consumption in Europe and 11% in the United States, and have cost in the ballpark of fossil fuel-based energy. This has been achieved thanks to a redirection of technological change away from a singular focus on fossil fuels towards greater efforts for advances in renewables. In the US, the primary driver of this redirection has been the government subsidies to green technologies, as well as the changing norms of consumers in society. The same can be done for the balance between automation and human-friendly technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I now recognize Dr. West for 5 minutes.
Chairman Yarmuth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify. I am co-author with Brookings President John Allen of a new AI book entitled Turning Point: Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. And I also am the co-editor of the Brookings Technology Policy blog Tech Tank and co-producer of the Tech Tank podcast. In my testimony, I'm going to argue that artificial intelligence is one of the transformative technologies of our time and likely to have major ramifications for the workforce. AI is being deployed in a number of different sectors, and its usage will accelerate in coming years. Its development is going to necessitate rethinking our policies in the areas of budgeting, infrastructure, healthcare, education, workforce development, and economic development. As AI and other emerging technologies become widely deployed, there are several possible ramifications for the workforce: job loss, job dislocation, job redefinition, job mismatch, and job churn. For example, there can be job losses in entry-level positions as firms automate routine tasks. There can be geographical dislocations as positions migrate to urban population centers, and there can be job churn as people move from company to company. In an economy where benefits are tied to full-time employment, any increase in job churn will create instability in people's ability to maintain income and benefits. Most of the issues noted above have grown worse with the advent of COVID-19. The pandemic has revealed stark inequities in access to online education, telemedicine, and opportunities for remote work. As an illustration, African Americans are far less likely than whites to access online educational resources, but far more likely to suffer from the coronavirus. It's hard to estimate the precise impact of technology innovation on the federal budget because there are so many ramifications for government revenues and expenses. But one thing that appears clear is we're going to need greater investment by both the private and the public sectors. One area is digital infrastructure. Right now, there are around 18 million Americans who lack sufficient access to the internet. You need an online connection to apply for many jobs. A number of people do not have the connectivity required for online education, telemedicine, and remote work. So it's vital that we close that gap so that all can benefit from the digital economy. The emerging economy presents challenges with respect to ensuring health and retirement benefits. Any increases in unemployment or people having part-time jobs will create some hardships. In today's digital world, workers need benefit portability to survive a turbulent working environment. Organizations need to shorten their vesting periods for people to become eligible for company retirement contributions. Right now, many organizations do not vest employees until they've worked at the firm for 1 or 2 years. And if there is increased joblessness, lengthy vesting periods will lead to shortfalls in retirement income.
Basically, everything that can be done, every best practice.
In a world of rapid change, it is imperative that people engage in lifelong learning. The traditional model in which people focus their learning on the years before age 25 and then get a job and devote little attention to education thereafter is becoming obsolete. In the contemporary world, people can expect to see whole sectors disrupted, and they will need to develop additional skills. The type of work that people do at age 30 is going to be very different from what they will be doing at ages 40, 50, and 60. One possibility to encourage continuing education is through the establishment of lifelong learning accounts. They would be analogous to individual retirement accounts or state government-run 529 college savings plans. But the owners of the account could draw on that account to finance online learning, certificate programs, or job retraining expenses. As America deploys AI and moves to a digital economy, its two coasts have fared much better economically than the heartland. According to research by my Brookings colleague, senior fellow Mark Muro, only about 15% of American counties generate 64% of GDP. Far too many parts of the United States are being left behind. One way to address this is through regional innovation districts. These are public-private partnerships that boost innovation in heartland cities. And the districts include regulatory relief, tax benefits, workforce development, and infrastructure. To summarize, it's crucial to think proactively as tech changes unfold. The longer we wait, the more painful the transition will be. Now is the time to start having the discussions required to make meaningful changes. And I applaud the committee for providing a platform for this important conversation.
Thank you, Dr. West, for your testimony. And now recognize Dr. Matheny from Louisville, Kentucky. You recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmuth. Thank you, Ranking Member Womack and members of the committee. And thanks also to my colleagues at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, whose research I'll be drawing from today. AI is a general purpose technology with a broad range of applications in healthcare, agriculture, energy, transportation, national security, and scientific discovery. Advances in AI are likely to be applied across many sectors of the economy, spurring growth and enabling new technologies. Policies to strengthen U.S. leadership in AI have enjoyed bipartisan support, at least during the decade that I've worked on the topic. I worked on AI strategies for both the current administration and the last administration, and there are more similarities than there are differences. Both administrations emphasized the points that I'll make here today, and each had a positive outlook on the potential for AI to improve American health and prosperity. As Michael Kratsios, the U.S. Chief Technology Officer, recently said, our future rests on getting AI right. AI will support the jobs of the future. Jason Furman, the previous chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in the last administration, said that his biggest worry about AI is that we do not have enough of AI. So while AI will cause changes to the labor market, this has been true of every technology since the Industrial Revolution, and this country has adapted. I believe we will adapt to AI and will be helped by more economic research on the likely effects of AI and automation on the labor force, and by benchmarking to assess progress in various applications of AI. The United States is in a strong position globally. By most measures, we lead the world in AI, and our lead is due to key structural advantages. We have an open society that attracts the world's top scientists and engineers. The National Science Foundation shows that over half of the master's and PhD level computer scientists who are employed in the United States were born abroad. We have a competitive private sector that spurs innovation, and we maintain strong international partnerships. While the US alone funds only 28% of global R&D, with our allies, we fund more than half. We should double down on these strengths. We should ensure that we remain an attractive destination for global talent by broadening and accelerating the pathways to permanent residency for scientists and engineers. Most research suggests that increases in high-skilled immigration yield increases in jobs and wages for Americans due to immigrants' contributions to economic growth and the creation of new companies. We should also ensure that small and mid-sized businesses have access to the computing power needed for AI applications. We can leverage the purchasing power of the federal government to buy commercial cloud computing credits in the private market and award them through federal grants and contracts competitively, as the National Science Foundation has done through its Cloud Bank program. We should also strengthen our alliances and foster the responsible use of AI through organizations such as the Global Partnership on AI, of which the United States is a founding member. China has made extraordinary technological progress in recent decades, and its future prospects should not be underestimated. But US policy should be based on an appreciation of the strengths that have driven our leadership in AI thus far and how they can be leveraged in the future. While our private sector leads in AI, the federal government plays a key supporting role. Federal research funding laid the foundation for the current wave of AI progress. Federal funding should continue to focus on areas where the private sector is likely to underinvest. That includes basic research, safety and security, testing and evaluation, and verification and validation. The National Institute for Standards and Technology should be given the resources needed to lead interagency and public-private collaborations on AI testing and evaluation, including establishment of a national AI testbed, a digital platform containing public and non-public data sets, code, and testing environments on which AI systems from industry, academia, and the government can be developed, stored, and tested. Fourth and last, the United States should ensure that it has access to leading-edge microelectronics. This country is the birthplace of microelectronics, and we continue to design most of the world's leading-edge systems. But most devices are now manufactured elsewhere. Offshoring most of our semiconductor industry has increased the risk of supply chain disruptions during crises. The United States should strengthen US-based semiconductor manufacturing to reduce supply chain risks and to increase the number of high-quality jobs at home. At the same time, we should work with our allies to ensure that democracies remain at the leading edge of microelectronics by investing in joint research programs and by enforcing multilateral export controls on the manufacturing equipment needed to produce advanced chips. The United States and our allies produce more than 90% of this equipment, so we're in a particularly strong position. Legislation such as the bipartisan proposals for the Chips for America Act and the American Foundries Act can help maintain that position. With these 4 points on the benefits of AI as a general purpose technology, the sources of US leadership in AI, the federal government's role in supporting the private sector, and the importance of microelectronics, I thank the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Once again, thank all the witnesses for those statements. We'll now begin our Q&A session. As a reminder, members can submit questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and their responses will be made part of the formal hearing record. Any members who wish to submit questions for the record may do so by sending them to the clerk electronically within 7 days. As we usually do, the ranking member and I will hold our question periods till the end. So I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay, Mr. Chairman. All right.
Yes.
Thank you. So whoever said this in the very beginning was right, that no topic perhaps more, while exciting some people, I would say inspires more fear, consternation / paranoia than AI. So all of the presentations were very interesting. I want to go back, though, to a point that was made very early on by one of the witnesses, because something that I learned, certainly today, if you look at our tax code, we treat capital and labor very differently and certainly make it much more attractive for capital versus labor. I didn't realize that has not just been a recent tendency, which was always my impression, but one of the witnesses stated that goes back a ways. So I was wondering what any of the witnesses would think about constructive ways that we could bring equality to our tax code, ideas like treating capital gains as ordinary income. There's a discussion right now, obviously, perhaps started unintentionally by the president in terms of the use of the payroll tax for funding Social Security and Medicare. I'm curious about these ideas because, as my line of questioning probably suggests, I'm certainly one who thinks that at the very least, labor and capital should be treated equally in our tax code, and we shouldn't have our thumb on the scale, which in my view we heavily do in treating capital more favorably, and thus making it actually more attractive for companies to replace the McDonald's worker with the touch screen that I now use. I'm advertising my bad eating habits, but that now we have at so many of our fast food restaurants. So I'll open that up to any of the witnesses, and certainly any ideas or proposals you would have. And if you agree with my view that capital and labor should be treated more equally in our tax code.
Who wants to take that? Dr. Asamoglu. Unmute, please.
Okay, yes. Somehow I was muting and unmuting and muting myself at the same time. Thanks for that question. Yes, I was the one who talked about the taxation of capital and labor, and it's a complex topic. Economists actually differ in all full disclosure. There are some economists who passionately think that capital should be taxed at a very low rate or not at all. But I think in the age of automation, the asymmetric treatment of capital and labor in the tax code has a lot of costs. if you live in a world where every piece of capital needs to be combined with some human operators, there are still problems with asymmetric treatment of capital and labor, certainly distributional consequences. But there is a better case that increased demand for capital equipment is going to trickle down to workers. But during our current era where automation is so prevalent, from the McDonald's checkout kiosks to customer service to machinery, numerically controlled machinery, robots and algorithms everywhere, I think the asymmetric treatment of capital and labor does create more severe problems. Now, if that wanted to be reversed, for example, going back to the to the 1980s or the 1990s, when capital and labor were still treated asymmetrically, but the gap was smaller, a couple of items would help a lot. For example, reversing the very generous depreciation allowances, which were often introduced during recessionary times as temporary measures and then weren't completely reversed later. That would be a very major step. Then there is also the issue of, why we have corporations that choose their own tax status as corporations versus C corporations, and that has changed a lot over recent decades. And often that's a way of reducing the tax base for capital through some sort of tax arbitrage. And I think that's something that needs to be thought through, especially since Ranking Member Womack said this committee is going to look for ways of increasing tax revenues. And exactly like you have expressed, Representative Boyle, one has to also consider the taxation of capital gains and other items. If you wanted to go on the other side, there has been a long line of argument in economics going back several decades that payroll taxes are particularly problematic. And in the United States, that's actually a very important part of the taxes that labor faces. But of course, I recognize that right now with the budget deficit, it makes more sense to think of creating that symmetry by increasing the taxation of capital, especially broadening the tax base for capital rather than eliminating taxes. But certainly payroll taxes are something to think about in the future as well. Thank you.
All right. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes. Mr. Woodall, unmute if you're on. Not answering. Well, then I will recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today. And many thanks to our witnesses too. I'm in my car, so I apologize if things are jumping around. But I'm an IT guy. I was in undergraduate and graduate school in the late 70s, early 80s when AI first came on the horizon. And today, there is no doubt, we all know it, technology spans every sector of our economy. Investments in emerging technologies such as AI, blockchain, and the Internet of Things have the exciting potential to drastically improve our economy, national security, and our very way of life through greater efficiency, increased global competitiveness, and creating countless other applications. In addition to domestic uses for AI, the Department of Defense has been developing and utilizing AI applications for a range of military capabilities, including intelligence collection and analysis, cyber and information operations, logistics, command and control, and also for semi or fully autonomous vehicles. But we all know the United States is not the only country developing AI capabilities. China, in particular, is investing billions in AI. It's imperative to our national security that the United States continues to be the leader in developing AI and other emerging technologies. However, China resorts to stealing innovation or subsidizing state-owned enterprises. This is not the role of America's federal government, nor should it be, given the innovative spirit of the American people and the exciting advances in technology already occurring right here at home. Rather, it's imperative that our federal government enable the private sector to flourish by removing barriers to innovation, something that President Trump and his administration has taken important steps to do so. And supporting private sector research and development collaboratively through strategic federal investments in agencies such as the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So I'm very pleased to have introduced H.R. 6940, the Advancing Tech Startups Act, which is part of a larger public emerging tech agenda to create policies that foster American innovation, secure our supply chains, and protect American consumers. Specifically, my legislation promotes a national strategy for encouraging more tech-focused startups and small businesses in all parts of the United States. It's vital to our national security to reduce our reliance on other countries such as China. And as I've stated, we don't need to rely on any other country. We should once again tap into American ingenuity and unleash the American innovation and entrepreneurship that we're famous for. So, Dr. Matheny, some suggest that the United States may be at risk of falling behind in AI development. For example, some experts predict China could, in the near future, surpass the U.S. and take the lead in AI development. In your opinion, where does the U.S. currently stand globally on AI? Are we leading the way or falling behind?
Thank you, Congressman Johnson. I think that the U.S. has a strong lead, but that we can maintain it by drawing on our structural advantages compared to China. First, most scientists and engineers in the world weren't born in either the US or China. And many more of those scientists and engineers would prefer to work and live in the United States than they would like to live or work in China. That's a great advantage to the United States. High-skilled immigration was key to our victory during World War II and during the Cold War. We were simply able to get more scientists and engineers on our side to win. The second is we do have a more competitive private sector, and sir, I think your efforts to empower small businesses where there's so much innovation is really key to our success. Thank you.
Are there some actions that we in Congress can take, or do we need to do more to maintain our global competitive edge in AI, especially given where China's going and the major investments that they in space?
I think there are two things that I would emphasize. The first is just how important our immigration policy is to allowing us to lead globally, given that this is one of the asymmetric strengths that the United States has compared to China. And the second is our lead in microelectronics. It'll be very difficult for China to match us if we play our cards right. We shouldn't rest on our laurels, but if we pursue policies that strengthen our semiconductor industry, while also placing the appropriate controls on the manufacturing equipment that China doesn't have, and that China currently doesn't have the ability to produce itself, and is probably a decade away from being able to produce itself, we'll be in a very strong position. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Yep, gentleman's time has expired, and now I recognize the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. So technology has certainly addressed some of the isolation problems that people have felt during the pandemic, and look how we're communicating today. So there's been a lot of important changes that technology and opportunities that technology has provided for us. But even before the pandemic, I think there were many consumers that were reporting feelings of helplessness when it comes with respect to the digital economy. On my subcommittee in Energy and Commerce, which is the Consumer Protection Subcommittee, we've talked a lot about technology and its ups and downs. And we know that big tech has actually allowed fraud and fake news and fake reviews and counterfeit and stolen products that are thriving on their platforms. And we've talked about, they come in and talk about self-regulation, and I think it's pretty clear that that isn't working very well. But here's the other question. They ask about, consumers are concerned about privacy. So Dr. West, I want to ask you, a functioning AI needs data, but we also need to protect consumer privacy. So in your view, what are the main issues related to consumer privacy and control and ownership of data that we need to consider through as we think through the use of AI technology?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. It's a great question. Privacy is very important to consumers. You can look at any set of public opinion surveys, and that often ranks very high on the list next to security. The problem with our current approach to policy at the national level is it's mainly based on what's called notice and consent. Like when you download software or you install an ad, you get this 20-page document that nobody reads, and at the bottom, if you want to use the app, you basically have to agree to it. Nobody reads these. We did a national public opinion survey and basically found that to be the case. So my Brookings colleague, Cam Carey, has been doing a lot of work on thinking about new privacy legislation, and what he proposes is basically get rid of the notice and consent because it's not effective in protecting people's privacy, and basically holding companies responsible for their data sharing practices, improving transparency so consumers know more about what is going on, improve everybody's sense of what kind of data practices are being deployed. I mean, there are all sorts of geolocation features that are now built into apps. If you check the weather, basically the weather app is localized to you. So there's a geolocation feature there. There's all sorts of privacy problems that get developed there. So basically, we suggest a greater accountability for companies. California, of course, at the state level has adopted a much tougher law than what we've had nationally. We really encourage Congress to embrace the issue of privacy at the national level. We don't want to end up in a situation where there are 50 different privacy laws. I mean, that creates havoc for the tech companies, makes it difficult for them to innovate. We need a national privacy law that can really address the concerns that consumers have.
Thank you. In the remaining time that I have, I wanted to really ask any of you who wanted to comment on this. You know that AI is used in policing, in social work, in banking, and in healthcare. And we also know that this is a time of racial reckoning in this country, disparities that we see. And we had a hearing in my subcommittee on the issue of discrimination built into algorithms, built into our technology, built into AI. And I wanted to just ask whoever to talk about how we can ensure that there's accountability to make sure that there is not the kind of built-in bias that discriminates against many in our population. Someone grab this.
Anybody want to handle that real quickly?
I can speak quickly. I think that we have to consider what the algorithms are replacing. And in some cases, they're replacing human decisions, which have perhaps a different set of biases, sometimes driven by the fact that the humans are using less information or don't have a full view of someone's circumstance, like in resume screening, being too superficial. So in principle, when well-designed, when training data is carefully selected, and when best practices are used, actually digitization can improve the situation and reduce bias, but it has to be done well and it has to be done carefully. So I believe that we need more research, we need more best practices, and whenever they're used in government situations or regulated situations, we do need to include accountability and ongoing monitoring in order to make sure there are no unintended consequences. Often engineers themselves don't understand the source of the problem and they won't look for it unless they're asked to, but they also like to use best practices if those are delineated and available. And so this is partly just a maturation of the industry and a maturation of the best practices. So I'm long-term optimistic, but we have to do the hard work to make it improve things rather than make them worse.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired, and now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me a second chance. You've always been gracious in that way.
Of course.
Mr. Matheny, I wanted to thank you for mentioning the stability in national AI policy between the two administrations that you've had an opportunity to serve. We tend to focus on the chaos, which I think leads to less confidence, as opposed to the leaders in the room who are working hand in hand, administration to administration. Could you talk a little bit about that? We're about to come up on another major election. Do you anticipate that stability in policy continuing, whether it's into a second term of the Trump administration or the first term of a Biden administration?
Thank you, Congressman Woodall. I would expect there to be continuity in the U.S. strategy on AI. I think there really has been a bipartisan consensus that I've seen, and a lot of continuity at the Office of Science and Technology Policy in particular, which I think has done a great job both in the last administration and in this administration, continuing much of the strategic work that was laid out. Michael Kratsios and Lynn Parker in particular at the office have been outstanding in coordinating the interagency. They've led a smart and ambitious AI strategy, which I hope to see continued. It's I think, one of the best cases of bipartisan coordination around a key technology topic. Thank you.
I very much appreciate that. Dr. Athey, you mentioned not just in your response to Ms. Schakowsky, but also in your opening statement, a need to be aware of unintended consequences. Are there particular unintended consequences that weigh on you in your work, or is that just a general admonition as we plow new ground?
Well, I think maybe one answer relates back also to the question about labor versus capital and excessive automation. In general, firms are going to be thinking primarily about their bottom line, and they're often short term. So it's going to be, a firm might be indifferent between a worker and a machine from a cost perspective, and if they're indifferent, they'll go with the machine. But of course, from society's perspective, we care about the jobs, and we care about the people, and we care about their transitions. So we do want to think about how are we investing in this R&D generally. We can't always count on companies to take the longer term perspective, and our national innovation strategy and R&D strategy can, in principle, develop this general purpose technology in a way that focuses more on augmentation of humans. So one thing about this general purpose technology is that somebody makes better AI and then lots of people adopt it. And so if somebody makes AI that helps replace humans, lots of other people can copy it. But if universities or a particular company or government invests in AI that augments humans, it's also the case that can diffuse. So I think that we need to be intentional about our strategies and recognize the places where we as a society care about the direction of technological innovation so that it pushes more and makes it cheaper and easier for the private sector to then pick up augmenting technologies. A second thing that I worry a lot about is just that the most recent innovation has been in black box technology. It's powerful in general purpose because it does the work for you. An engineer who doesn't know anything about a domain can plop down, modern machine learning, and the machine learning will spit something out. But if it's just applied without a context, without domain experts, without ethical experts or legal experts or people who are thinking about national security consequences, we might end up in dangerous situations. And so actually, like the privacy and security issues, I think are especially concerning when we realize that all of us are being observed and monitored sort of 24/7 by our phones and by everything that we do as it all gets digitized. That can create national security issues in that somebody always does something wrong, so we're available for blackmail. And we're also going to see in the future, because it's so easy and cheap, a lot more worker monitoring, which can be good for safety. We can make sure people are driving safely. We can make sure, truck drivers aren't asleep. We can make sure that workers aren't going to be injured on an assembly line if we use video to monitor them. But again, we're creating this massive corpus of information about people. And we also need to make sure that that information is applied in a fair way and for benefit rather than be exploiting in various ways.
Mr. Chairman, I know Dr. Asimoglu referenced companies that were doing it wrong. I hope as this hearing continues, we'll have an opportunity to talk about some of those companies that are doing it right so that we can benefit from that experience. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. I'll make sure we do that. Thank you, Mr. Woodall. Now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I assume you can hear me okay?
We can.
I very much appreciate you holding this hearing. It's a very interesting and I think obviously very important topic. I represent an area that's seen a pretty drastic drop in manufacturing jobs over the last 30 or so years, often and almost exclusively attributed to trade policy. And while trade has clearly contributed to the loss of manufacturing jobs in my region of East Central Michigan, Flint, Saginaw, Bay City area, clearly technology has played a pretty significant role in that job loss. We've gone from, in my hometown, about 80,000 direct manufacturing employees in the auto sector to something around 10,000 right now. But we still produce about half the cars that we used to produce. So that technology disruption obviously has had a pretty dramatic impact on my community. And now we are trying to imagine, and you are thinking and researching about how AI may have that same disruptive effect. So I'm curious about any thoughts that any of you have about the pace of development of AI as it relates to manufacturing and specifically around the production of automobiles. I know this might require some speculation, but I think it's really important that we engage in that speculation. And I'm particularly interested, Dr. West, your references to the work of Mark Muro. I have a past relationship with Brookings and did a lot of work around this space, particularly around communities being left behind. So I'm curious if maybe starting with you, Dr. West, but others might comment on those two aspects, the pace of these trends as they might relate to heavy manufacturing, particularly the auto sector, and then any thoughts you have on sort of compensating interventions that we can deal with that might add to the way we typically deal with trade disruption through trade adjustment assistance or something like that, how we might think about support for those communities that are being disproportionately impacted by these trends. So maybe starting with Dr. West.
Thank you, Congressman. I do worry about job losses, and manufacturing is one of the areas where there's already a lot of automation and AI that's being introduced, and we fully expect that to accelerate. When you look around the world, there are countries that have almost fully automated factories right now, where it's basically a bunch of robots driven by AI technology and a handful of humans just monitoring the computer control panels. But it's not just manufacturing. Finance is going to be disrupted. The retail sector, Amazon already has opened a number of stores with basically no retail clerks. They basically use computer vision to see what you have put in your bag, or what it is that you're purchasing, and they automatically charge you as you are exiting it. So there certainly is going to be, I believe, an acceleration of job losses. And in terms of the geographic thing, the thing I would worry about here is, if you look at venture capital investment, 3/4 of it now is going into New York, California, and Massachusetts. So if anything, the geographical inequity is going to accelerate. Already, much of the high-tech industry is centered on the East Coast and the West Coast and a few metropolitan areas in between, but much of the country is being left behind. And my Brookings colleagues in our Metro program have done a lot of work on this. This is very worrisome. It creates political anger. People get upset. They feel the system is rigged. They feel like they're being left behind. So we do need to think about public policies that will address the geographic aspects. Now, one positive development is the growing tendency to move towards remote work. It turns out you no longer have to live in Seattle or San Francisco or Boston or New York in order to work for these tech companies. In fact, the real estate has grown so expensive in those areas that they're kind of pricing a lot of employees out of that market. So they are starting to rely more on remote work and telework. And so I think public policy can contribute to that. There is a rural digital divide where people who live in the country have less access to broadband and less access to high speed of broadband. They are less able to take advantage of these remote work things. So Congress should definitely invest in infrastructure development in the broadband area just to reduce that digital divide, so that as companies start to move to telework and remote work, that everybody can take advantage of that, including people living in the heartland.
Thank you. It's a fascinating subject. I look forward to pursuing it further. My time's expired, so I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Yarmouth, and I appreciate you holding this informative hearing today. I want to note something that you said at the beginning, and that government moves at 10 miles an hour when the rest of the economy is moving at 100 miles an hour, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I personally am excited about the opportunities that AI brings moving forward. I know that several people are apprehensive about it, but I think that we as policymakers need to be excited about it. A couple of things I want to comment on before I go into my questions. Number one is I think that there's been a lot of discussion about R&D, and I think one of the essential roles of the federal government is a robust investment in basic research and development. And I say this from the perspective that I represent two large Tier 1 research and education institutions, and also have a great high-tech footprint in several parts of my district that rely on those discoveries that come out of the search for curiosity, or the search for basic knowledge from basic R&D. The second thing is I think we as policymakers need to be very careful about trying to get into adjusting the mix of capital versus labor, because as you said early on, Chairman Yarmouth, government moves slowly, and I think we as policymakers could wind up being well behind where the economy is if we're not careful with that. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for participating. Dr. Matheny, I have a couple of questions for you. As we're all aware, Taiwan, through its TSMC foundry, is a leading semiconductor manufacturer for many countries, and particularly we in the U.S. rely on them for AI development. Does the U.S., the first question is this, does the U.S. rely too heavily on other countries for AI development, and what can the U.S. do to lessen this reliance on other countries?
Thank you, Congressman Flores. And first, thanks also for your emphasis on research. I think one of the most exciting opportunities is for AI to be applied to itself, to accelerate science and engineering. I think some of the more exciting demonstrations that we've seen on this include DeepMind's use of AI to solve protein folding problems, which are really important for biomedical research. So I hope we'll see more of that in ways that can expand the economy and produce jobs. To your very good question about Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, I think the US does rely too much on imported semiconductors, which introduces at least 3 risks. The first is that our dependence on manufacturing in Taiwan means that we have a supply chain that could be disrupted by a conflict with China. The second is that Taiwan is vulnerable to having its workforce and its IP poached because of its proximity to China. And third is we risk having our own know-how vanish in a key industry the more we import. I think Intel's recent announcement that they were considering outsourcing their most advanced manufacturing, which would be really the only US-based advanced manufacturing of semiconductors, is extremely worrying. So I think it's prudent to reshore some semiconductor manufacturing to the United States, particularly the leading edge chips that are used to power many of the AI applications that will be valuable in the future. And beyond the security benefits, this would also create new manufacturing jobs for Americans. Thank you.
Thank you. You actually answered the second part of my question that talked about the economic and national security threats that exist if we rely on other regions and other countries. Let me ask a second question. As you're aware, AI development requires talented workers with particular skill sets. In order for the U.S. to continue leading the way in AI development, it's critical that we continue to develop domestic talent in addition to attracting talent from abroad. When you answered Mr. Johnson's question a minute ago, you talked about attracting the best talent from abroad. What policy recommendations do you have to ensure that the U.S. successfully cultivates a domestic talent supply for AI? And for instance, talk in particular about what the education system would look like for that group of persons.
Thank you for asking the question. My sister is a school teacher, and a great one. And so I have a deep sympathy for school teachers who are trying to teach computer science and mathematics. These are difficult topics to teach, but we need to find ways of teaching more of our students the strong math skills that they're going to need. Mathematics is really the discipline that is most useful to succeeding in AI. And we simply need to find better ways of teaching math to our students and finding ways to teach more of it. We also need to address the AI labor needs that aren't in research and development. I know discussions around tech talent often center on the scarcest and most educated parts of the workforce, but a critical talent gap also sits in skilled labor. And for our skilled labor to compete globally, it will need help from technology. China enjoys a manufacturing advantage due to its vast workforce, which is about 11 times the size of the US manufacturing workforce. But despite its larger size, the Chinese manufacturing sector only produces about twice the amount of value add. So the average US manufacturing worker is about 6 times as productive as the average Chinese manufacturing worker. So reshoring manufacturing will require that we both increase the parts of our labor force while also increasing the productivity per worker, which is going to have to be achieved through both training and technology. One example is cobots, robotic systems that complement human workers in order to increase their productivity per person. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matheny, and my time has expired.
Okay, gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this hearing, appreciate this opportunity. Ranking Member Womack, I apologize if my connection is spotty, but I have 2 daughters learning remotely, sucking up a lot of the bandwidth. I guess that would be in more ways than one, not just virtually, but mentally for their parents, but that's a whole nother story. Let me just say I appreciate this opportunity to have this type of hearing, especially when it comes to the risks of automation for workers, especially for those jobs where automation only provides a marginal cost and productivity benefit over the human worker. Now, I think we all sort of agree that we need to focus on these workers and how such changes will affect them, but we need to be very careful not to discourage automation or technological progress, because I think all of us agree that automation and AI hold tremendous promise when it comes to improving our lives and our economy. Now, it can also eliminate, as we know, some very tedious tasks so that workers can focus on being more productive, and it does lower prices for consumers, improving our daily lives and raising the standard of living for low-income families. So because automation has that ability to increase worker productivity, it's our responsibility to ensure that workers benefit from their increased value. But taxing or otherwise disincentivizing automation, I don't think will save jobs. And I do think it will make our economy less nimble and risk us falling further behind our competitors like China. And that's why I believe we need to continue to invest in automation and cutting-edge technologies like artificial intelligence. That's why we should continue to keep the U.S. competitive in these areas for the sake of our security. And yet, if the successes in these areas do lead to displacement, it is our responsibility to help those workers. And we should be prepared to support those workers, rethinking our social safety net, how we retrain those workers, bolstering their workers' rights, strengthening collective bargaining for higher wages and job security so that their productivity increases. That also means we need to study how workers can best complement automation and artificial intelligence, but we should not shy away from these fundamental challenges by stunting progress and protections for our national, economic, and food security. Now, here on the Central Coast, when it comes to food security, we live up to our job. We live up to our responsibilities. We have a lot of farms, farmers, and farm workers, and as Dan Kildee will tell you, I live in the salad bowl of the world because of it. We have a lot of specialty crops that cannot be harvested like the traditional row crops in the Midwest concerning corn, soy, and wheat. We have crops where human discernment as to what's a ripe, safe, and aesthetically pleasing product is really difficult to replace. But our ag workforce is very necessary right now. Unfortunately, though, it's aging and it's shrinking. And the pandemic is highlighting not just how valuable that workforce is, but how vulnerable they are. Now, obviously, it's a two-pronged solution. Yes, one is immigration reform, looking at the Farm Workforce Modernization Act that passed out of the House this year. The other, though, is investment in specialty crop mechanization, dealing with how you can harvest those types of very difficult to harvest crops. Now, obviously, the private industry is working more to develop these technologies and to fill that labor gap. But I believe the federal government has a critical role to play in helping oversee and scale up these investments, if I may say so. Now, my first question, Dr. Athey, is as we develop these types of technologies to save labor, to save our food security, what steps do you think are necessary to protect existing farm workers and for them to transition and adapt to these new types of existing circumstances?
Thank you for that question. I believe that historically we have not really done the greatest job in dealing with displaced workers in general. You know, in economics class, we teach about, you know, all the benefits from trade and, you know, more efficient production of products. But then as a society, we forget about that second step where you actually get the redistribution done and deal with the consequences. But where I'm optimistic is that I think we have a lot more tools at our disposal now to reach people, to use data to figure out what is the best next step for a worker, what types of upskilling will actually work for a person in this circumstance. And that in turn can help people feel comfortable in the investment, because of course, for a worker to take their scarce time and invest in trying to acquire a skill, they need to have confidence that if they do make that effort and take that scarce time and money, they will be able to use that to get a new job. And so I think we've just had services in the past that haven't really responded to the individual worker, to the individual worker's circumstance, and then provided them with effective training and relocation services. So, but I believe that we can do better. I'm collaborating with a project in Rhode Island, working with the state government to try to improve both the data to evaluate training programs and as well try to help workers have better information for making choices. And I think that with technology and data, we can do better, and we can also reduce the cost of delivery by bringing services to people remotely in their homes at the time that's convenient for them, so they don't have to get in their car, they don't have to hire a babysitter and you know, sacrifice income in order to receive the training that they need. So I'm optimistic about the future, but we have to be intentional about it, and we actually have to execute and follow through on those types of promises.
Agreed. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Now, gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes. Unmute. Mr. Hearn, unmute. Oh, you need to be helped?
No, I did it twice there. It's good. Okay, we're good to go.
There you go.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member Womack, for holding this important hearing today, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being here today. This is a topic that I find quite fascinating, being an engineer myself. You know, unfortunately, due to the unforeseen spread of particular virus from China, economic growth has been stunted, and so this really gets to be a real exacerbated issue right now. That's it's up to us really to fix. The U.S. economy has been forced built by hardworking, first-starting Americans, and we only move forward as a country if we continue to support innovation and encourage workers to get back into the workforce. AI can act as a great catalyst to both needs, and the U.S. government should create a regulatory environment which enables growth and innovation rather than creating hurdles to both. If we want and would like to beat China and others in this space, as our own available workforce declines. My question now, there's been many of the answers to the questions I had, but one of the witnesses really is pretty fascinating as we get into we've talked a lot about the technical aspects of this, but Dr. Anthony, let's just talk about the workforce. There's been a lot of talk about workforce replacement, but we haven't talked at all about the lack of workforce. And for the first time in at least a generation, government figures show a larger number of open jobs than people out of work. Obviously, this is pre-COVID, but this is only 6 months ago. And certainly a lot of us, probably all of us, hope we get back there very quickly. And part of that problem is demographics, labor and market growth. The U.S. birth rate has been falling, and it is a 30-year low. And simultaneously, baby boomers have hit a retirement age, a big force behind the falling number of unemployed. Some would argue it's the real problem with our Medicare issues and our Social Security issues. We don't have enough people working to fund those programs, along with the aging population. In fact, the McKinsey Global Institute research on the automation potential of the global economy focuses on 46 countries representing about 80% of the global workforce and has examined more than 2,000 work activities and quantified the technical feasibility of automating each of them. But the proportion of occupations that can be fully automated using current technology is actually pretty small, only about 5%. And if you could speak to that AI as our workforce continues and declines and our need for consumption grows, I'd like to get what your thoughts are on policies. And I'm being flippant in this, but that if you go back to the McKinsey group, they force higher fertility and prevent us small getting older, which are two driving forces. And while that's ridiculous, you can't. There leaves one, and I would like to piggyback off on my colleague from California when he talks about immigration. There's a big push, and the president's push for this, for merit-based immigration, bringing people in that can add to where we need to go from a technology standpoint to help us continue our drive for AI. So as you're aware, AI requires talented workers and particular skill sets so we can continue to lead the way as our witnesses have testified. And so what policy recommendations do you have to ensure the U.S. successfully cultivates a domestic talent supply in this space? Will students need a different education to pursue careers in AI versus what they're doing right now?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And you've raised a number of really crucial issues. Of course, everyone on the Budget Committee, I'm sure, is acutely aware that the amount of our budget that we're spending on older Americans is increasing dramatically. And so we need to really think about how we're going to deliver services to our aging population more efficiently. And also, what can we do to keep people in the workforce, happily in the workforce, longer, which might be in a second career or a part-time job that looks very different than how work looked in the past. So I think a first important consideration is to think about what will all these elderly people need and how can we help them live independently, live fulfilling lives, and get the services they need. I think AI and automation can actually help quite a bit, because some of the things that make it difficult to work as you age include, physical challenges as well as memory challenges and certain cognitive aspects of a job, all of which can be alleviated through augmenting AI or physical robots, which might allow humans to work longer and focus on the aspects of the job that involve interpersonal relationships, comforting seniors, helping them get their psychological needs met. So you might have seniors helping seniors. It's also the case that actually there's a lot of service work at that time that in the end may not fully be replaced by automation. So I see that this aging population is a challenge, but it's also points our way towards solutions for those people. And more broadly, the demographic crisis highlights for us that immigration will be important because we see a shortage of workers on the horizon and a shortage of taxpayers in the working age. And when you look at the demographics, it's much harder to predict what's exactly going to happen to automation in 10 years, but we already know how many 20-year-olds we have in the country who will be 40 in 20 years. And unless we bring in more 40-year-olds, we're kind of stuck with what we've got. So we can expand immigration, but we can also think about how to most effectively use the people we have and allow our aging population to contribute in meaningful ways as they age. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Yep, gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding another really, really important issue facing the country. Before I begin, I do want to also add my welcome to Representative Jacobs, who I had the privilege of serving with in the New York State Legislature, and I'm delighted that he's joined this committee. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with my neighbor to the west and upstate New York. I just want to just say a couple points. I think some of the comments by the other members have been really, really provocative, and there are a ton of questions here. To me, this isn't a question of whether or not AI, machine learning, robotics, and innovative technology will reshape the landscape economically and as it relates to the workforce. It is doing it. It will continue to do it. It's happening in many respects at breakneck speed. And I think, and the question for us, we've also always marketed ourselves as a nation of opportunity, a nation of innovation. So the question is, as public policy challenges emerge because of it, what do we do? How do we think through this? So I think that's why this hearing is so critical. The way I see AI, I guess I think about it in a couple different buckets. One is to the extent that it could displace human beings in some jobs and in some occupations. More, I see it as ways to create tools that will allow people to do their jobs faster, better, more efficiently. But there's no question it's going to have an impact, and we need to think about it. One of the things that, as it relates to the budget, and perhaps people can talk about this, the president has talked about elimination or deferral of payroll taxes. Obviously, that has an impact on Social Security, has an impact on Medicare. But even beyond the call for reduction in payroll taxes, to the extent that there's a displacement of workers or a lessening of wages because jobs become a focus of commodity-like activities, what I'm struck by is so much of what we've built on the safety net, Medicare and Social Security being two of the most obvious, built into a system where we get revenues based on payroll. So, there have been suggestions by some folks looking at this to the extent that we look at displacement. Should there be alternative ways of looking at taxation so we can continue to provide resources to Social Security, to Medicare, to make sure that, particularly as the baby boom generation starts to move into some of these programs, and you're going to see this significant percentage of the population in Medicare, in Social Security, and given the reproduction rate in the United States is at an all-time low, you mix that in with AI and machine learning, robotics. Could anyone, perhaps Dr. West, maybe you could help answer this. Is there something we should be looking at in terms of a replacement for payroll taxes that's based on, and I know people have talked about the difference between capital and people when it comes to investment and tax treatment. Can you talk a little bit about how we can make sure that our revenue base doesn't decline if we see jobs displaced by either AI, robotics, machines, et cetera?
That's a great question, Congressman. I think we do need to think about the tax system, both in terms of tax rates, tax credits, but possibly also new types of taxes. So, if you go back 100 years to the start of the Industrial Revolution, we found our tax system to be inadequate at that time. And so we developed new taxes, developed new social programs. And I think now, as we're moving into the digital economy, we need to be asking big questions like that. So I'm not sure exactly what the kind of new taxes could be. Like, people propose a financial transactions tax that would kind of help with income inequality in general. Other countries are implementing digital services taxes. So there is a lot of new ideas that are being formulated there. And on the first part of your question, you're right about the importance of market competition, and the key in innovation always has been small and medium-sized enterprises. We're worried about a loss of market competition, and so I think Congress should really think about ways to promote small and medium-sized enterprises, just so we can maintain the startup economy that has fueled American prosperity for several decades.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important comment, and And I would just say in the few seconds I have left, what I do worry about is we don't want to create disincentive for investment in innovative technologies. We also don't want to put ourselves in a position where, as a result of that, we've displaced workers and the payroll taxes that support much of our social infrastructure. So I want to thank the panelists. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for a great hearing. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired, and now I recognize in his debut Budget Committee appearance, Mr. Jacobs from New York.
Right. I think, can you hear me or no?
You're live.
Having some problems here.
Oh, you may have muted yourself. Yeah. Now you're fine. You should be good.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, everybody. Great to be on. And I guess I need a little AI to help me with the unmuting here. I just wanted to first comment on Dr. Matheny on some things you talked about regarding semiconductors. I have a area, Batavia, New York, in my district, where they've been working for a number of years in developing a advanced manufacturing park. One of their hopes would be to lure a semiconductor facility there because of the inherent assets we have in terms of low-cost power due to the proximity to the Niagara Falls power plant and also abundant water. And in talking with them, they discussed this issue of the loss of our semiconductor industry nationally. And one statistic I just wanted to echo why this is so important, what you're talking about. In the year 2000, the United States had 24% of the semiconductor production in the world. Now they're at 12. Now we are 12%. In the year 2000, China had 0% of the production, and now they have 16%. And they are investing another $1 trillion in this sector in the next decade. So, this is a major issue, and look forward to pushing for policy nationally that will help level the playing field so we can make sure that we maintain and grow this sector for the important reasons that are mentioned here. I wanted to ask a question to Dr. West. My district, as we talk about inequalities, would be geographic. My district is rather rural and definitely have concern. We have major issues with lack of high-speed internet access, and it's being more pronounced right now with the needs for distance learning and telehealth, but in an effort to be economically competitive in the future. And I was just curious, so clearly I am all in for any additional money and programs to push for rural broadband because it's important as any other piece of infrastructure right now for our area. But in terms of, you mentioned innovation districts as the model of something to try to allow areas that are not on the coast to be competitive in the new day here. And I was wondering if there's examples of success that you have of innovation districts. Thank you.
Well, it's funny you should ask that, and the chairman will love this because Louisville is actually an example. Louisville is an example where they have developed a pretty successful regional innovation district. Brookings actually is helping advise some of the organizations there. It's a public-private partnership, so you can talk to the chair about how they did that. On the rural part of your question, I can really appreciate this because I grew up on a dairy farm in rural Ohio many years ago, and rural areas are really being left behind right now. And so we really need to address the infrastructure part and especially the broadband part, because as I mentioned earlier, like there are opportunities for remote work. Like you don't have to live in San Francisco. You could live in your district and still work for any of these tech companies, but you need high-speed broadband. Just this week, my Brookings colleagues, Tom Wheeler, had a short report where he gave a couple of very specific ideas for the Federal Communications Commission, which he used to head. One is a reform of the E-rate program, which was set up to connect classrooms. It turns out there is a $2 billion surplus in that fund, meaning there is unspent money that was designed to connect classrooms. now that so many people are engaged in home schooling, we could actually redirect some of that $2 billion to improve rural broadband in order to facilitate homeschooling. It's very consistent with the purpose of that program. So you should talk to people at the FCC about that. And then secondly, with the Lifeline program, which the FCC also runs, including cable companies, not just phone companies, in rolling out digital services and broadband, just because today people are almost as likely to get their broadband via a cable company as a phone company. So if we could broaden the Lifeline program to basically address the ways people are ordering broadband, that would help. And also making including companies that offer prepaid services. So in the Tom Wheeler post, he talked about all these ideas, but I think they're particularly relevant for your district and other rural areas across America.
Great. Thank you very much. I yield back the rest of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. West. I highly recommend Mark Morrow's paper, and it's not just the chairman's Louisville district, but even in Paintsville, Kentucky, they've had quite a lot of success in bringing technology to rural communities, and I appreciate your work and Brookings' work on that. I had a question for Professor Acemoglu, whose work I admire very much. I was struck by this idea of excessive automation, and I understand the tax incentives that may be off, but bracketing that aside, what explains the move towards excessive automation? Is it a sense that there is some kind of market failure where companies are actually making irrational decisions to automate in ways that aren't profitable, or is it that it's marginally profitable, but it's not having aggregate productivity gains for society?
Thank you very much, Congressman Khanna. I think that's a great question, and it's a variety of factors. First of all, it is indeed the tax incentives, so we cannot ignore that. There is no natural rate at which capital and labor are going to be taxed, so it's a policy choice, and that policy choice is going to have consequences. A second important factor is that labor and capital use may have social consequences and economic consequences that go beyond what companies calculate. So, for example, if people are better citizens or they contribute more to their communities or to their families when they are employed, that's not going to be part of the calculation of companies. And it is part of policymakers to actually decide that. So do we, for the same GDP, would we be happy when that is produced by humans, partly, versus when a lot of it is produced by capital? I think a lot of policymakers would say, actually, for the same GDP, we would like it if we would like it quite a bit if humans are part of that equation, which means that we actually value, as a community, as a society, humans being part of that calculation. And technology has gone in a way that makes it possible for greater substitution of machines and algorithms. So some of those external effects that were less relevant now become more relevant. And the third factor is that it is not necessarily irrational, but different companies have different business models. So if you look at different periods in which the American economy has done very well while it was also automating, this diversity of perspective, diversity of approaches was very important. Let me give one example: mechanization of agriculture. That's an even more transformative automation event than the ones that we are talking about right now. The more than half of the U.S. economy was on agriculture, and there was a huge, tremendous decline in labor share in agriculture as machines started performing tasks that were previously done by humans. But during that period, American growth didn't just come from agriculture, it also came from other sectors that picked up labor that was displaced, or the children of the labor that were displaced often, because some greater human capital was necessary. So the manufacturing sector introduced a lot of both production and non-production jobs. A lot of the non-manufacturing sector expanded. So this sort of diversity of approaches, diversity of technologies was quite critical. So one of the things that may be less active today is that we are not using the enormous technological platform that AI presents us in ways that can create jobs, tasks, opportunities for labor in other sectors of the economy. So, for example, when earlier on there was a discussion of robots and what was going on in Flint, Michigan, that is absolutely central that there were a lot of production jobs that were eliminated. The same has happened in everywhere. If you look at South Korea, if you look at Germany, other countries that have introduced a lot of robots, production jobs were eliminated in more or less the same numbers as in the United States. But in many of these cases, there were also non-production jobs that were created more or less simultaneously, sometimes in the same companies, sometimes in the same markets. And that's what we haven't seen in the United States. So when you look at Flint, when you look at Saginaw or other parts of the industrial heartland, you have these production jobs disappearing, but we're not using the technology to create other jobs to compensate for these losses.
And very briefly,
So
how would you create other jobs? What would be one or two bullet points of what we could have done in Flint to create those other jobs?
Well, I think in Flint, it's a little bit hard for me to say from here what exactly the skills that would be easily transferable. But when you look at broadly, there are many applications of AI in education, in healthcare, in manufacturing that are completely capable of creating jobs. For instance, automation in manufacturing also enables job creation because it reduces offshoring. So there's a mounting evidence that not the jobs that were destroyed to trade with China or to the first wave of automation are not going to come back, but there are certainly opportunities for many jobs to come back, from offshore jobs to come back as automation process continues, because it's a cost-saving possibility. So many of those are not in the production line; they are in the supporting capacities, but they are very, very important and potentially high-wage jobs. And again, the evidence from Germany suggests that many of the jobs that were created, even in the same companies that were automating at the same time, were paying higher wages or comparable wages to the production jobs that were destroyed.
Thank you.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Had to find it. I'm sorry, I came on a little late, so let me just ask a couple of general questions. First, to any of the panelists, how real is the threat to laid off workers that their employers might decide to increase artificial intelligence rather than rehire their workers?
Any takers?
I can give a quick answer to that. We don't know. We don't know for sure. But in recent surveys, about 75% of companies are saying that they are either taking steps to increase automation or they're planning to do so. So there is a real possibility that some of those jobs will not come back even as the economy picks up. The other issue that we need to think about is that the sectoral composition of the economy is going to change in a post-COVID world. The hospitality sector will probably be much slower to come back. And so there will be a natural reallocation. Some of that reallocation is obviously healthy and efficient, but it will still have great costs on some of the poorer communities and some of the poorer segments of U.S. society. So I think those are, as some of the earlier comments indicated, questions related to the social safety net. But broadly, and this has been one of the main themes that I've tried to emphasize, it's not just a social safety net issue. If we think that displacement is just a social safety net issue, that would mean that we would be happy to have a lot of workers being displaced and then find ways of providing good social services and a decent standard of living to them. But again, I don't think that would be a healthy economy or a healthy society. That's why it's important for us to find ways of using our existing and technology know-how and our technological capabilities in order to find ways of deploying our enormously productive, our very well skilled workforce in other activities. Thank you.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up question to that. If there are going to be fewer workers, does that have budget implications on fewer people having taxes and therefore lower revenues?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. That's a very, very important question as well. So if you, one of the themes that I emphasize is that our tax system is asymmetric. It taxes capital less than labor, and it has become more so. That has major budgetary implications because if you look at the U.S. distribution of income, the share of labor has gone down from around 67% of national income to less than 58%. So that means that income is shifting away from the more heavily taxed factor to the more lightly taxed factor, and it will have budgetary implications. And another theme that I've tried to emphasize, but it was very quick, so this gives me an opportunity to underscore it one more time, is that part of the reason is because our capital tax base is very narrow. It's not just a question of jacking tax rates on capital and introducing huge wealth taxes or anything like that. There's just a big chunk of capital income that we don't tax. And that means it's costly, it's asymmetric, it may distort the allocation of capital and labor in workplaces, but increasingly it also has major budgetary implications. Thank you.
Does that include, we have tax credits for investments in machines, but not in education? Is that something we ought to address?
Absolutely, 100%. If you look at the decline in the tax rates facing capital, that went from over 15% to less than 5% in the last 20 years, about half of that is because of the very generous investment tax credits, which are so generous that if you have debt-financed capital investment in software for S corporations, you may actually be getting a small net subsidy. We have nothing similar to that for education or training. Thank you.
We're talking about education and training. To get into an AI job, you don't sign up for an education for AI. I think I heard math is important, but what should the Committee on Education and Labor be doing for higher education?
I could take a piece of this. One thing that I think would be especially useful is a tithe, a 10% allocation for federal research grants to go towards teaching. Because otherwise we're eating our seed corn. We're spending all of our federal R&D on the research rather than on the teaching. And in most of the major universities where AI is being taught, there's a natural tension for the professors to focus on research as opposed to allocating time to teaching. We need to make sure that we're training the next generation, and a tithe, particularly on NSF grants, could help with that. I turn it over to others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired. Thank you so much. That's a good point.
Absolutely. Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for the hearing, both with you and the ranking member, and thank you to the panelists. Let me just add a description that should not be taken at offense, but we're all speaking now to the haves because the have-nots are not in the room. And I think this is a very important basis upon which we are responding, because that's the focus that I will have, along with maybe a more definitive question about a tax scheme that would work to help AI. But I'm going to start with Dr. West, who early in his testimony mentioned the question of income inequality and worker dislocation. Those people today are not in the room. We as members of Congress represent a wide landscape of individuals. Can you pointedly, Dr. West, talk about what should be our response on the apparent and existing income inequality and the potential worker dislocation?
That's a great question, Congresswoman, and you're exactly right. There are income disparities, there are racial disparities. This is a huge problem. We're almost in a situation where technology is helping to fuel the inequality in the sense that the haves are doing better and getting tax breaks and have programs that support them, and people at the lower end aren't even in the game. They don't have access to the digital economy. There are 18 million Americans who do not have broadband. A large number doesn't have a high-speed broadband. So the way that we need to address these issues, certainly infrastructure investment, the things we've talked about earlier, rural broadband, broadband in underserved urban areas as well, putting more money into education, and especially opportunities for online education, because that would be a way to help overcome the disparities, but you need the broadband in order to be able to access that. Same thing applies in terms of telemedicine. One of the features of COVID is it has jump-started what already was in existence, a trend towards telemedicine that has really accelerated it. But not everybody is able to share in the benefits of that. And given the racial disparities in the incidence and fatality rates of COVID, like that's a scandal that people who need it the most are not getting access. So there are a lot of different things we need to do, and we certainly need to address the inequities in the tax system.
Well, clearly it means that out of the Budget Committee, we should be focusing on just the infrastructure that you've mentioned. It's a shame that in 2020 we're still fighting to get broadband everywhere. And for those of us who are watching our schools open and they are hybrid or virtual, to see people standing in line trying to simply get laptops because they don't even have that, and as well hotspots or the hot boxes so they can have the opportunity to have access. Let me do a round robin question dealing with COVID-19. We've heard a very stark admission of the knowledge of how deadly COVID-19 was as early as February 7th, 2020, if I might. Let me ask all of you to comment how COVID-19 could have been attacked, if I might, starting with Dr. Athey and going to Dr. Mathney with artificial intelligence in terms of treatment, in terms of outreach, in terms of saving lives. Dr. Is it pronounced correctly? Dr. Atley?
Yeah, Dr. Athey, thank you very much for the question. And I think the telemedicine point is super important. We were a little slow getting started and trying to get information to people, getting people in touch with their doctors. Without broadband access and without good access to medicine, we weren't always making good decisions for patients early. Another thing is that actually using AI and machine learning to understand what treatments work best was actually very limited in the United States by our disjointed medical system and the inability to do analysis that incorporates data from multiple sources, because as the epidemic happens, patients are being treated in hospitals. The insurance companies only get the data later once bills have gone out, and that's not fast enough. So it turned out that we were just unprepared to be able to do analysis that spanned multiple medical centers and give real-time intelligence. We also missed opportunities to have a more coordinated approach to clinical trials and R&D that was really focused on getting the most information and the best treatment decisions possible given the patient flow that we had. There was just a lack of coordination. And I really hope that if anything like this ever happens again, we are prepared to be able to do the right analysis and coordinate the studies and the research. And that just requires really advanced preparedness and a lot of kind of air traffic control from the federal government. And AI and machine learning can only do their work if they're given the opportunity to access data and really influence decisions. Thank you.
Okay. Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Series, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Hear you fine, yes.
Yeah. I want to thank the panelists for being here today. You know, I always think of a job as something that creates self-worth in a person. And we seem to be obsessed with this productivity word. And obviously, artificial intelligence creates a lot of productivity. But you have countries like China and you have countries like India who have such large populations. And as artificial intelligence is more productive, more and more people are left behind. Do you think that these countries with such large population will ever come to a point and they say, okay, artificial intelligence is great, but we have passed beyond the ability to provide jobs for the people of my country. Maybe we should slow down this artificial intelligence that is creating so much automation and leaving so many people behind. Because as you know, if there's no work in a country, it leads to unrest. I was just wondering if any of the panelists would want to address that, where a country would say, hey, let's put little brakes on this because our population is staying behind, is being left behind. Can anybody talk to that a little bit?
I'll be happy to. I'll be happy to comment on that.
Okay.
I think first of all, I completely agree. A job is much more than just productivity. I think self-worth, importance for the community, importance for society. I think these are critical. But the tragedy in some sense is that, at least on the current measurements, we are not even doing that well on productivity. Despite the bewildering array of technologies all around us and all this excitement that goes on, we are actually during one of the eras in our history where productivity growth is lowest. This goes to underscore what I was trying to emphasize, that it's not a question of AI versus non-AI. It's a question of how we are using AI technology. And if we're not using it well, we would destroy jobs and all of the self-worth and community contributions that we're talking about, and also not reap all the benefits in terms of productivity. I think that's exactly the sort of situation we are in right now. So if a lot of AI goes into marginal activities, such as self-checkout kiosks or things that humans can do very well, then it will not bring the productivity gain. I don't think that China is ever going to turn back from AI, partly because they have made a huge investment in that, but also because part of the AI's appeal to authoritarian regimes is that it actually provides a much better monitoring system, facial recognition, snooping on communications, control of the internet. But those are exactly the sorts of things that are not going to bring huge productivity gains, and they're not going to contribute to making jobs more meaningful. But if you look at what American companies invest in, it's not that different that we pour a lot of money into facial recognition and monitoring aspects of AI as well. So that again goes to my broader point that I think there are ways of making use of the AI platforms in a manner that's going to bring much better social benefits and jobs and productivity than we are doing currently.
So productivity worker for the United States is 6-to-1, as somebody mentioned before. And in China is 1-to-1. So I was just wondering if China does not want a 6-to-1 or an 8-to-1 productivity ratio.
I would say China definitely wants that and has made huge progress.
Doesn't that leave a lot of people behind? I mean,
right.
If you reach that kind of a productivity like the United States.
Well, it may or may not. If consumption keeps up with it, and that productivity gain is broadly distributed in society, it may not. In China, it hasn't taken that form. Inequality has actually increased a lot. The gap between cities and rural areas, and even within cities between migrant workers and non-migrant workers, have opened up hugely. But sure, I think there's a huge drive in China towards increasing labor productivity, but they're also willing to invest an enormous amount of resources in order to monitor these workers better, in order to monitor communications, civil society participation, and other social activities, even if those things are not productive, because they do need to maintain the current political system. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Yes, yes, sir. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Womack from Arkansas, for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of my colleagues who have participated and to the witnesses. Thank you very much. A very interesting discussion. I'm going to start where I kind of left off in my opening remarks, and that was about matters of fiscal accountability at the federal level. And I don't need to tell anybody engaged in this forum this afternoon that that we're in some very difficult circumstances right now. COVID has exacerbated it 3 times more so than what we would have otherwise had in terms of a deficit goes. And to my colleagues on this call today, I'll sound a bit like a broken record. I'm an appropriator by nature. I just happen to be the ranking member of the committee and had formerly chaired the committee. But as an appropriator, I'm very concerned about the escalating cost associated with mandatory spending, how much of the federal budget it is commanding, and the squeeze, as I call it, that crowding out effect that it's having on the matters of the discretionary budget that we appropriators are in charge of or should be in charge of, last few years as an exception. But that's a whole nother story. But the fact is that if we're going to invest in anything in our country, if we're going to ask the federal government to have a role in resourcing a lot of this R&D, then it is going to face continued and escalating pressure from the mandatory outlays that continue to consume a larger and larger share of federal resources. So here is my question, and I'm going to pose this to Dr. Matheny, and that is, with that in mind, if we can all agree that there is this crowding out effect, how would the federal government prioritize spending on matters of research and development and so forth in the AI spectrum? And what have you seen from your federal government, if anything, that has worked? So help me understand how we would prioritize the spending that goes toward a more robust AI circumstance in our country.
Thank you. It's a great question. I think that the federal government can most cost effectively focus on basic research, on testing and evaluation, and on safety and security, areas that suffer market failures so that the commercial sector is likely to underinvest. Much of the current wave of AI research that we see right now is due to federal investments in basic research, particularly by the National Science Foundation and by the Office of Naval Research and DARPA, dating back to the mid-1980s, which funded early work on deep learning, provided training grants to much of the current generation of AI researchers. And that work in basic research really does need to continue so that we fund the next generation of breakthroughs that will fuel future AI systems. Equally important is the work of the National Institute for Standards and Technology in its benchmarking and its testing and evaluation. That has been critical for actors in both the private sector and the public sector to be able to bring their tools, to have them tested on a level playing field, understand where they work and where they break. And just as important also has been the federal government's investments in microelectronics. In the 1960s, NASA effectively started our microelectronics industry. But we also have examples of less successful programs, very large projects, overly broad goals. I think the Strategic Computing Initiative, which ran from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s, is an example of that. So where the government can help is really in the cases where the commercial sector isn't going to invest on its own, where the goals, though, can be clearly defined, and where we can lift up and address those market failures. Thank you.
You bet. Dr. Acemoglu, am I even close on the name? Okay, good. Thanks for the thumbs up. And Mr. Series reiterated the point you made, or I think it was you that made the point early on in your testimony, that China had 11 times as many people in the workforce, but they were only 2 times as productive, that the American worker has proven to be the most productive worker, I guess, on the planet says a lot about our ability and about our capacity. One of my concerns is that the pace of the private sector in virtually every area is a lot faster than our education system seems to be trying to deliver. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, I believe so. I think it is definitely true that our education system has lagged behind. AI, for all the reasons that we have discussed today, has already started changing the work of the labor market, and it will change it even more. But our education system, both at the university level, but also at middle school and high school level, is very backward looking. We continue to teach in the way that we used to, for the most part, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. AI actually provides, I think Susan mentioned this already, provides tremendous opportunities for revolutionizing many of the key sectors such as healthcare and education. AI can be used for taking over some of the tasks that educators do that are quite boring, such as grading. But even more importantly, it can create a much more interactive classroom, enable teachers to understand the specific challenges and needs of students and cater their teaching and curriculum to their needs in real time. It can enrich what we teach and how we teach it. There are already companies that have completely transformed their training systems using AI. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, but sure, we are lagging behind. And it is absolutely critical, as you have pointed out, for our success that the American worker maintains their productivity edge over other nations. But we have not done very well in that regard either. So if you look at a inclusive measure of productivity growth, what economists call total factor productivity growth, in the 3 or so decades following World War II, that was growing over 2.5% a year, and it's around 1% for the last 20 years. So we are not really doing enough to keep our productivity edge relative to other nations, many of whom have faster productivity growth rates.
Mr. Chairman, my final question, and I'm going to throw this on the table. I don't know really who to direct it to, but we've seen some challenges in recent years of building government-industry partnerships. And what's, to me, even more disconcerting is that a lot of the companies that we're talking about are now not only not building those partnerships, but they're just unwilling to work with the federal government or work with, partner nations, or you can pick from the spectrum of issues. Just last year, Google pulled out of a major AI project called Project Maven with the Department of Defense. It's my strong opinion that we need to see some change in this area. Why is this occurring, and what are the long-term consequences of not having the proper relationships between government and industry? And is it the slow pace of government in general? Because we all know that we don't operate with a lot of speed.
I mean, Congressman, I would be happy to jump in on that question. And I agree it's important for a government to work with industry. I think the Google thing, there were some idiosyncrasies to that decision. Other tech companies are embracing the role of working with the federal government. But I do think, as part of your concern about debt and deficit issues, we do need to think about agency modernization, just because we have to get the federal government acting much more efficiently than it is right now, just in terms of the administration of services. And the way to cut some of the program costs without hurting the beneficiaries is to make the organization more effective. And so the public sector still lags the private sector in using AI. Just one quick example, every federal agency should be using AI for fraud detection. It's something that's very common in private companies. We know that there's waste and fraud in the federal government. The AI looks for outliers. It looks for unusual activities. Like, this is one tool federal government agencies should be using to try and get a better handle on the spending side. I think that's an example of where technology can be part of the solution.
Yeah, and in the budget that when I was chairman that we prepared for FY19, a key component of trying to do the deficit reduction was the fact that we had billions and billions of dollars of improper payments, and there has to be a way that we can get after those without unnecessarily burdening ourselves. But anyway, my time is expired. Thanks again to all the panelists. Thanks to my colleagues. Chris, welcome again to the Budget Committee. And Mr. Chairman, as always, I'm going to yield back my time, and with regrets that you didn't get to see Authentic win the race there on your home track. But nonetheless, a good derby.
I thank the ranking member. I did watch it on television. Fortunately, I tried to set up a betting account, and they were so swamped with people trying to do that, I couldn't get on, so I didn't lose anything.
Well, AI,
that
if we'd
was the
had a little
plus.
better AI platform, we could have probably fixed that early on.
Probably so. No, thank you for that. And I yield myself 10 minutes for my question. Once again, thanks to all the witnesses. It's been an extremely enlightening conversation, and I think a very, very valuable one. I'm going to kind of segue off where the ranking member was, because we spent most of the hearing talking about impact on jobs, and I think that's kind of the natural topic and how that might impact tax revenues and so forth. But we really didn't focus much on how AI might help reduce expenses for the government. And I can see, I think, Dr. Akey, you mentioned telemedicine, and I think there's a lot of potential, as you mentioned, for reducing costs in Medicaid, transportation costs, as well as probably getting better diagnoses and drug interactions and so forth. I think there's a lot of possibilities there. Where might be some other areas in which there actually could be a positive impact of AI on expenses for the government?
Thank you for that question, Chairman. And I think that that really does pick up from the ranking member's comments as well, that government can be much more efficient than it is. Now, I would have actually been pretty scared 10 or 15 years ago to suggest governments invest more in IT, because IT projects often fail in private sector, frankly. And when governments take them out, we have a lot of problems with procurement of large IT projects. But one of the things that I think has been really impactful in how AI and machine learning have been diffusing through the economy in the last few years is the way in which IT services delivered has changed. We're having more software as a service, we're having more cloud computing, so that you don't have to take on this huge project, which has huge risk, and then you're kind of locked into a software for the next 20 years, but rather you're getting services that meet your needs, that are updated automatically, and where a lot of R&D can be centralized and focused on use cases. So I do believe that it is a good time to start thinking about modernizing the federal government infrastructure. And then alongside of that, these very common AI applications like fraud detection was mentioned, also security. Cybersecurity is a huge problem. And again, because of its antiquated infrastructure, the federal government and all of its employees are vulnerable. And so if we can start modernizing and we can put in best practices, we can deliver services more efficiently and effectively. Now, I also want to pick up on another comment that you made, which we really didn't talk enough about today, I think, which is that, when labor is used as an input, then that's affecting the cost of a product. Daron and I have both mentioned that there are some cases where, the worker and the machine are sort of creating similar cost structures, but there are other settings where investments can really lower the marginal cost of providing services as well as the marginal cost of receiving services. And actually, especially for state and local governments, that's very true. People are standing in line and wasting their time and taking off of work to get needs met, and a person is sitting behind the counter doing something where all of this, would just be so much faster and better if you could just get do it electronically and get your needs met. And
Yeah.
So while that loses a piece of employment for the worker sitting behind the counter, maybe there's other things that your government could be doing, but, more child care, more elder care. There are other services that are under provided where those human workers could be better deployed if we use technology to do things where the human time is getting wasted on both sides of the table.
I appreciate that. And I think even though we are the U.S. Congress, we're focused on the federal budget. We also need to think about impacts on state and local budgets. These are all tax dollars, and all. We do have a federal system. As I said before the hearing started off the air, that this is something I've been planning to do for about a year and a half now. And when people would come to my office, different groups would come to my office when they were still doing that, I would invariably ask them at the end of the meeting what impact artificial intelligence is having on their profession or their activity. And I never forget, I had the Kentucky CPAs in the office, and they were there to lobby about tax policy, which is understandable. At the end of the meeting, I asked them, in your professional meetings, do you ever talk about artificial intelligence? And their eyes all opened wide, and they said, that's the #1 topic at all of our meetings, because they see a dramatic reduction in the need for accountants because of artificial intelligence. I had the War College, people from the War College in my office. I asked them that. And one high-ranking soldier said, we don't think that there'll ever be a battlefield decision made by a human being again. And I'm sure he was exaggerating somewhat, but the idea was that AI can consider all the hundreds of, if not more, variables that would go into a decision as to when or where to stage a military action. And so particularly about IBM, I've talked to IBM people, they say Watson, at least in their analysis, can now do 70% of what lawyers do with greater accuracy. They can read MRIs. Watson can read MRIs and CT scans more accurately than radiologists can. All of these things lead me to say the impact is not necessarily just going to be on the routine type of jobs, that there are going to be some very high level jobs that are going to be changed or eliminated in many cases, which connects me back to the education issue. That when you look at professional jobs that require years and years and years of education and hundreds of $1,000s worth of tuition, and you're seeing the possibility that those jobs might be eliminated, how do you think this is going to change the future of even professional education? Dr. West, do you want to try that one?
I think you're right. It certainly is not just entry-level jobs that are going to be affected by AI and automation, but higher-level jobs, including the example you gave of radiologists. Accountants should be worried. They're exactly right, because there's a lot of really good finance AI that is out there. Financial advisors, the same thing. So I do think that we need to keep our eye on the education process. When I talk to young people today, I tell them one of the most important skills they need to develop is adaptability, because they're going to face such a changing economy, a changing workforce, and changing job needs and job skill needs, that whatever knowledge and skill they have at age 21 when they're graduating from college, it's probably going to be completely inadequate 10 years later. It certainly is going to be inadequate 20 and 30 years later. So they're going to need to constantly upgrade their job skills. It's the reason in my testimony I talked about lifelong learning. I think the adult education aspect is going to end up being as big as higher education today. So the education component is very important.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. It's exactly what I tell students when I talk to them too. You're going to have to be adaptable. It's the #1 talent. I promised Mr. Woodall, Dr. Asamoglu, that I would let you answer about, he asked about companies, corporations that are doing the right thing. So in the time I have left, you want to expand on those that are good examples for us?
Sure. I think let me say two things. One is an answer to Congressman Woodall's question. But before I do that, I want to sort of build on what Dr. West has said. I think adaptability is extremely important, and it's going to become more important. But I also think that there's a lot of uncertainty about which types of jobs AI is going to be more threatening to, and there is some disagreement. But if you look at the current uses of AI, which are still sort of limited, they are still more geared towards more low-paying jobs. And part of the reason for that is because when you look at higher-paying jobs, they involve a variety of tasks, and only some subset of those tasks can be automated. And when the rest aren't, then the adaptable workers especially benefit a lot. So I expect AI technology, in whatever direction it goes, to add to our concerns about inequality. So that, I think, is a very important thing. When it comes to which companies are using AI, I think there are many companies in Silicon Valley that are using AI in extremely creative ways. I think the problem is that some of those are not very, very good when they look when you take their social implications into account. So, for instance, I think you can use AI. It's a sort of a niche sort of industry right now, but there are a couple of companies that are working on using AI for doing test grading. That's going to be a growth industry, and I think it's going to be very, very useful. But there are many fewer of them that are using AI technology for creating more adaptable classrooms. There are a few, but I would say that's one area that's actually very promising. But because of the complexity of the question, I think one of the concerns is that when I've talked to some of those companies, they think that their technology would not get a hold in many school districts because it would involve hiring more skilled teachers, and school districts are not going to have the resources or the interest in doing that. So I think there's a sort of a chicken and egg problem. There's a lot of creativity that could be put to use AI in very, very new and inspiring ways, but we may not have the infrastructure to support that completely yet. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. My time has expired. So as we close, let me once again thank all of you witnesses for your time and your wisdom and knowledge, and all the members for participating. And if there is no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.